think we're going through a serious moment of transition in which the two Sanders campaigns, I think, have demonstrated to a lot of people that electoral change is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, within the US context, because then also you have the consequences of, Trump's presidency and now Biden's presidency, both of which I find catastrophic for working people. And so I think that there is an increasing both interest in leftism and political mobilization around leftist causes. At the same time, there is a lack of viable infrastructure in the sense of developed parties, unions, a kind of culture of the left, which you do have. I spent a lot of time in France, and you have that in a country like France, where you have, even on TV shows, you have people debating politics, and there are Marxists who are on TV. Of course, you'd never have that on CNN or anything like that. And so one of the most important struggles is to build up that infrastructure so that we have much more cultural, political, labor-based infrastructure for a kind of culture of the left. And I do think that we're headed in that direction. I think there are some very positive signs on that front. I also think that reality is on our side. One of the great quotes from Michael Parenti that I often reference is, he said, the problem with the ruling class that they've always had is that reality is radical, because reality makes people radical. Reality is homelessness and downward mobility and stagnant wages and all the shit that working class people have to deal with. And given that reality is radical, people are increasingly looking for and getting involved in alternative modes of organizing. And that's extremely promising. And that's one of the reasons that there's so much propaganda being pumped out, both in order to try to funnel people into the Democratic Party and its machine, or further to the right, simply to funnel people into fascist modes of organizing through all the anti-China propaganda, all the anti-Russia propaganda, and things like this. And it's another reason that we need a real kind of cultural power in order to direct people in a different direction, to identify who their real enemies are. The real enemies aren't Russians or Chinese people. The real enemies are the capitalist ruling class, who are producing propaganda that are telling them that the Russians and the Chinese are the real enemies, or the Mexican immigrants, or, there's lots of other potential enemies, the black people, et cetera, et cetera.
So do you think we'll see an end to the American empire in our lifetimes?
I think it's very possible. Depends on how long we live, and depends on how good we are at organizing.
Okay.
But I think that one of the single most important things for people to understand, and it took me a long time to understand this, is that an enormous part of the capitalist cultural apparatus, right, the system of culture in the United States that beams out and dominates the airwaves so much that 90% of what all US Americans see and hear is produced by 5 mega corporations, right, that produce the news and also produce all of the entertainment. That one of the principal things that they do is project US power and US exceptionalism, telling us that the US is the greatest country on earth, the most powerful military, the most developed economy, on and on and on. So much so that people can't even see very basic things. Like, the US has lost an innumerable number of its military interventions. It's backing the Ukraine, and it cannot win that war. It has not, as of yet, been able to win that war in the way that the US administration wanted to win that war. Afghanistan was a debacle. Iraq was it's quote unquote successfully, toppled the Saddam Hussein, but has, turned the country has caused enormous problems within the country. The US empire has not been able to overthrow Cuba. They've not been able to overthrow China. They have been able to overthrow a country like Grenada, a very small socialist country. In that regard, people have to recognize that even at the military level, the US empire, since Vietnam for that matter, a moment in time at which barefoot peasants handed a resounding defeat to the US empire. right? We have to be able to see through the power projection of the US empire and recognize not only that it's fragile, but that its history has been marked by a whole series of losses, and those losses have been victories for working people around the world. And so the world is changing very, very quickly. The COVID crisis was a good example of it, with more than 1 million deaths in the United States and all of the economic consequences from that. And Lenin famously said that there are, I'm paraphrasing here, decades where almost nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. Our moment in time resembles.
Wait, when did John say that?
Lenin.
I was trying to make a joke. Sorry.
Oh, John? Wait, who's John?
No, you said Lenin said that, and I was like, oh wait, when did John say that?
Oh, got it.
I knew. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, sorry. I'm slow on the uptake there. And I think that our moment, at least as of late, has been a moment in which things are changing very rapidly in the world. And so it gives it's a promising moment for continuing to build power in the direction of dismantling the US empire. And so part of, at least not just my project, but I think a collective project, is to figure out how these institutions and how the intellectual apparatus functions, and to map it out. Because once you map it out, you can understand how it operates and how best to intervene in order to transform it, right? If you don't understand how it operates and you think, oh, there's just like one person who was paid by the CIA or whatever, you're not going to understand who your enemies are, right? You need a theoretical mapping. But the other thing that is really important is developing infrastructure for the production, circulation, and consumption of alternative ideas that have real transformative use value. We need alternative media platforms. We need alternative educational platforms. We need alternative publication platforms. And we need to develop it collectively so that there's infrastructure, material support for these forms of research, these types of conversations. I mean, obviously it's one of the things that we've been trying to do with the Critical Theory Workshop. We're nested within the academy. We work with the academy. We have academic debates, we have intellectual debates, but we also want to be bringing to the table things that have been largely expunged or excluded from the academy in various ways. And that means that the project can't be individual, right? It's not just about individuals and I'm going to publish a new book that's going to become more famous than Zizek's book or whatever. I mean, back in my rad lib opportunist days, I did think that way. They were bad times. I felt lonely and isolated and self-important. I'm really glad now that I'm working with a lot of other people to develop the type of infrastructure that we need, because we need a lot of it and we need to do it quickly. But I'll leave that aside and instead say that you're absolutely right that there are a lot of people, particularly within a reactionary culture like the US, who have these right-wing conspiratorial theories where they do get certain things right. The bigwigs, the fat cats, they steal from you. They're out to get you. That's true. The government is against you. That's true, right? And so one of the things, and thinking here of Eduardo's question a little earlier on, is that we want to be educators not just in a classroom. We want to be involved in political organizing, in connecting to people, in broader popular education. And so for me, one of the best ways of dealing with this is that you have to recognize that ideology functions like a gestalt. It takes empirical data from the world and it formats it in an explanatory framework. Have people seen, there's the great image of the duck rabbit image? It's an image and you look at it, it looks like a duck, and you look again and it's a rabbit, but it's the same image. That's a gestalt shift, right? And so what I think is important to do in outreach, in connecting with people who have some right factual ideas, they see the lines in the drawing, you have to get them to see a rabbit instead of a duck, or vice versa. Meaning, you have to allow them to identify, your real enemy isn't the immigrants. These are working people whose lives were destroyed and they're coming to this country to try to survive. Your enemies aren't the black people who have been subjected to horror upon horror in the history of US capitalism. Your real enemies are those who have constructed a system where you have to work yourself to death, and where your kids get poisoned by water that's not drinkable. Those are your real enemies. So take the facts, validate them. Be like, yeah, you're right about that. You're absolutely right. But then help give them the frame and through the form of understanding that allows them to see who their true enemies are, and then they can be brought on board. Ideally, if you're good at doing it. But it's also like those messages have to be reiterated. You have to have a culture that actually does that. One of the things that's powerful about a lot of Latin American societies is that there's a kind of culture of progressivism. So you're not just one person saying, hey, guess what? There's a different way of thinking. There are bookstores and there are performances, and there's just a kind of vital leftist culture that was decimated in the United States. Unfortunately, but that is rebuilding really quickly. Because like the many-headed hydra, it comes back. Because reality is radical, and people recognize that the system doesn't work. It should be quite obvious given unemployment levels and the housing crisis and many, many other things. Oh, okay. So I'll just read the question real quick. I don't know if everybody can see it. This is Sabrina. I'm wondering about the division of mental and manual labor and the relationship between the sort of intellectual proletariat, as academics are kept precarious, as Gabriel pointed out, and the manual labor workers who are more overrepresented in the global south. How does collective organization work across this division? Yeah, it's an important point, because one of the things that capitalism has done historically is it divides those who have the right to work with their mind and those who have to work with their hands. They underpay the latter, they usually pay a little bit more the former, and it's also a form of class warfare, because then you can develop the professional intelligentsia who's paid a little bit more to make sure that the ideas, the gestalt that's given to the general working class is a gestalt that doesn't allow them to see what's going on and doesn't allow them to see the real enemies. So it's an enormous, enormous problem. And of course, a lot of socialist organizing is about breaking down those borders. And so popular education is about validating the ideas of working people, because ideas come from practice. And if you want to know somebody who knows something about exploitation, talk to somebody who's working as a dishwasher, as somebody mentioned earlier, or a lot of other. I worked construction for years. That's one of the ways in which I understood what exploitation was. You work 14-hour days in rural Kansas when it's 104 degrees in the summer. You figure it out pretty quickly. You don't need to actually read many books to understand it. But part of the socialist project as well is validating that knowledge that manual laborers have about material reality, but then also providing an intellectual framing that allows us to move from existential level of experience to a more objective apprehension, so that you don't just know what your experience is, you see how your experience was produced by a system and is producing other people who are having similar experiences, and therefore it allows for systemic analysis. And so maybe the only other thing that I would say is this is one of the reasons that a lot of organizations that cut across these divides are so important. So if it be parties, various associations, unions, or other organizations that bring together people who are working within the intellectual realm and as working class people, because one of the problems in the university is you're in a bubble, and if you're only talking to other people, you don't realize like how actual people live, these rat-infested homes and like the stuff they have to deal with day in and day out, because your material reality is protected from it. And so the organizations, associations, and parties that do that really it's also about educating the intellectuals, right? It's not only about giving an intellectual frame to workers, it's about educating intellectuals about what real life looks like and how their work might be able to contribute to that in various ways. I think it's so important to engage in multiple levels of discourse and practice. So in my own life, I write for, under pseudonyms for completely out of the way places that probably 5 people read, but I also try to write entirely differently for venues like the New York Times, which is a neoliberal bastion, but has the reach, right? And this is just one instance. It's the same with cultural practices and whatnot. Instead of limiting our agency, as often people have done on the left, they say that, well, there's one tactic that works and you have to do this, and making, for instance, a film for the mass population is more important than making some fringe film. I say, why not do both? Why not multiply our agency so that we can operate at different levels and intercede in those different levels? Because I fully agree with what you said about kind of knowing the logic of the spectacle and then thinking about ways in which you might want to engage with that in order to harness its power, but for alternative ends. And it raises enormous questions about the role of aesthetics as a potential site, an important site of intervention for redistributing what it is that people might regularly perceive through the spectacle apparatus. And there's phenomenal work that's been done on precisely this. So I couldn't agree more with the kind of invitation to not only think about it, but also do some of these things. Raised, there is the kind of important anarchist rallying point of delink and rebuild. Right? What do you do with a corrupt system? We delink, and what that means is that instead of waking up every morning and reading the New York Times or plugging into the kind of extant apparatus, you delink from it, but you rebuild with other modes of organization. And so there are a million examples of this, and it's not just anarchists, of course, who do this, but alternative press networks, the ones that David and I both publish in, are very important because they're not funded by the corporatocracy and because they provide a platform for information that is not vetted by the corporate powers. But then that is, I think, one part of a much, much broader constellation. And I know that in my own organizing, in fact, the co-authored piece that I pre-circulated for this session was developed in a publicly research collaborative, the Radical Education Department, and one of the things that we're invested in doing is precisely that, delinking from the modes of information that we have from the corporatocracy, the propaganda that goes into that, and the educational framework that comes with that, because at the end of the day, the media probably educates us more than any other form of education, but then at the same time to rebuild that in other ways in which you collectively resource intelligence. You do it in such a way that it's not about the privatized game of personal gain, personal advancement within a particular hierarchy like the academy or the press. In other words, that you try, and as much as possible in whatever corner of the world you are in, to develop alternative means of intellectual production. And that, I think, is quite powerful in the big sense. I don't think that the Radical Education Department itself is going to dismantle capitalism. I think that the world is much more complicated than that. But when you look at how capitalism emerged over the centuries, it was a very slow and gradual process, and there were tiny little workshops that were being transformed, etc. And so the dismantling of capitalism, I don't think, is going to come about with a messianic event. Unless perhaps the destruction of capitalism might be the destruction of the biosphere. That's the one proviso that I would add. The true end of history, I would say, not the one predicted by Fukuyama, but the cosmological end of history inscribed within capitalism itself. But short of that, I think the dismantling of capitalism will be something like the emergence of capitalism, which is a metastatic transformation.
Well, hopefully, if there are those changes, or the changes that I would be advocating for would be a kind of more revolutionary restructuring of the economy, along the lines of like what has happened in Cuba and elsewhere. But hopefully we will see some version of one of those reconfigurations in our lifetime.
I hope so.
Or at least I think that it's definitely worth struggling for, because the clock is ticking too, right? It's not like the planet is getting better. It's also not like the global economic situation is getting better, right? There's more socioeconomic inequality in the world today than ever in the history of humanity, and that's being driven by the capitalist system. And every sign now is that it's just getting worse. And so I do think that, like, models. What I really like about what you said, though, just to like pick on one point that where there's complete and utter agreement, is one thing that happens in a capitalist system is the creative labor power that we have, like the ability to do fun and interesting shit and not be tapped into or kind of have our existence defined for us by our vocation. Because most people have to work some shitty job, and so the hours of the day when they are the most vigilant and conscious, they're doing some paperwork or driving Uber or some other things. And to have a world in which our creative labor power would have the opportunity to express itself rather than just be a kind of cog in the capitalist system, like there, I think there's perfect and utter agreement. And I think that there's a great documentary film that's available on Vimeo if people want to watch it, called Cubanas. And it's just about the women of the Cuban Revolution. And it's one of the most interesting things is the number of women they interview who say, the greatest thing about the Cuban Revolution is the fact that I've been able to change my life over and over again. At first, I was a violin teacher, then I became a dancer. Now I'm teaching in high school. And the Cuban system allows me to do that because I'm not just a cog in a capitalist system, but instead I'm contributing to a social project. And that social project recognizes that I have creative labor power and that I might not want to express that in only one way that works for the capitalist system for like 40 years, and then they'll, put me out to pasture or whatever. And so the relationship between the socioeconomic system and individual life is really important in that regard. As most people who like do volunteer work or do things that they're passionate about really understand, right? If you're doing some mutual aid or volunteering at a bookstore that's like an alternative bookstore or something like that, sometimes actually work can be enjoyable,
Right.
And that's how it should be.
Well, then, to any future radical academics who are out there, what's your advice? How do you stay out of trouble? How do you find the good trouble and stay out of the bad kind?
Well, you have to navigate it like anything, like union organizers, like militants who are working various jobs, like lawyers who do their corporate job, but also are doing pro bono work on the side. Like being a class trader is something that a lot of people have expertise in above and beyond my own experiences. And I think that you have to try to, as much as possible, understand where the extant play of forces is, and not overstep certain bounds, because if you do, then you will be banished very quickly. And if you can maintain at least 1 foot within certain systems, because we could also talk about the entertainment industry, right? I know that you have a lot of experience and could talk at length about that. If you can keep a little toe or a foot within certain elements of the entertainment industry in order to be able to use it to your benefit while maintaining some level of integrity and some principles while doing that, then you might be able to use the kind of power of the monster against itself, so to speak. Well, at the same time, I would say, actually, I'm working on a book right now with Jennifer Ponce de Leon where we spell some of this out. I think there are really 3 tactics that cultural producers use. One is the one that I just mentioned, is that a kind of Trojan horse. Like you use the institution or the entertainment industry and you try to smuggle in a different message, but you use its enormous power to get your message across, which I do with a university or with publishing houses or journal publications and things like this. But another very important thing is to develop an alternative apparatus, our own system of production, circulation, and consumption of ideas and of culture. And I run the Critical Theory Workshop, which is an educational nonprofit. I began in 2008. That's one of our goals, is to have our own system of operations. And the third is ultimately leveraging power fully away from the capitalist system by establishing a kind of socialist apparatus that is such that the production of culture is in the hands of the people instead of the hands of the corporate overlords. So those are at least 3 tactics that I think are particularly important, and we can do all 3 or support all 3 at the same time.
Way out of oppression.
Well, I guess I would say 2 things. One is that I originally did my dissertation, ended up getting a job and things like this within this tradition. So there was an element of careerist opportunism in my earlier work. There's no doubt about it. Mea culpa. I'm embarrassed by it. I wish it hadn't been the case. I wish I had been better trained, and I wish that I had realized earlier on what was going on. But the whole system was set up for me to do that. And I was able to excel and was smart and quick and whatnot. And so I was able to give to the system some of what it wanted. Well, at the same time, I was always a materialist and always dedicated to ideas having some type of material consequence in the world. And the fact that I grew up on a farm working construction for a very large part of my life, I'm sure has a lot to do with that. And that is that I have a working class sensibility through and through. And it's not just a sensibility. I have, a rootedness within communities of struggle. And with that in mind, then I think that for me, the transformation that's gone on, at least within my own intellectual and practical work, has shed a much different light on the system that I ended up kind of excelling in to some extent. And that now, to address the question more pointedly of how I survive, is that I'm very dedicated to developing both communities and an institutional apparatus that allows us to have these broader discussions. to be truly scientific in the sense of let's open up the floodgates and bring in all the information and analyze the social totality and not just do a reading group on Derrida or Adorno or other such things. And in order to do that, I think you have to do at least two things, maybe even three, that I've been very dedicated to. One is you have to engage with collectives. You have to work collectively and find other people with whom you can develop an analysis, who have modes of expertise in areas that you don't have expertise in. And you have to give up on the individualist, opportunist game of thinking, I'm just going to come up with my new theory and my new hot take and everybody's going to love it and I'll publish a book on the pandemic like 3 months into the pandemic, as Zizek did. No, that's just opportunism and individualism. It's what the system wants. Don't give it to it. The other thing that I would say is that I'm really dedicated to developing alternative institutional frameworks that we can use to foster this type of collective work. So you mentioned that I direct the Critical Theory Workshop, which I founded in 2008 and is an educational nonprofit. And now there's a lot of other people involved, and we're trying to use it really as a space for having these types of rich intellectual conversations that allow us to call out some of the limitations of the academy and bring in information that's been foreclosed to a large extent. And maybe the last thing that I would say, and potentially the most important, is that if we are really interested in theory that is going to change the world, not just interpret it, or even worse, just create a jargon-like illusion that the world is being interpreted, then we need to be connected to collective struggles. We need to be embedded within activist communities. We need to be connected to organic intellectuals in the movement. We have to be connected to the larger kind of production within the journalistic world that is getting alternative messages out, building up that community and really being part of the movement, not simply because we'd have contributions as intellectuals to the movement, but also because we really have to learn from the movement. And I mentioned Domenico Losordo. I'll leave it on this note. I'm convinced that one of the reasons that he's one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century is because he was embedded in the movement, because he was learning from global class struggle and taking the horizons of his analysis from global class struggle, not from his own individual opportunism within the capitalist intellectual apparatus.
Wow, thank you so much. This is also what we are struggling to do, to provide Eastern European, these countries like Romania and Bulgaria, with a platform where we can discuss topics like this and build a journalistic cooperative here at the Barricade with journalists coming from Romania, Poland, and Bulgaria, and trying to provide alternative perspectives to the mainstream dominant ones. So thank you so much for being here with us. And to our viewers, if you like what you heard and saw, please go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebarricade. And to the extent that you can afford it, please support us because we count on you. So thank you very much, Gabriel. It was very insightful. And maybe you will come back to our show and Boyan will be here too. Unfortunately, he was not available today due to some health problems. See you all next week, and thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.